Hello, everyone. It's me again. It's Dermot Trainer. I'm looking forward to seeing you all tomorrow. But before that, of course, I have to present to you the second part of the first week of lectures. Obviously, lecture one, we looked at Reconstruction, and lecture two, we're going to look at the birth of Jim Crow. I guess before we get stuck into the details, I should say that, as you can probably tell by the background behind me, I've now arrived in Benedictine College. Before I kind of move out next week, just for the first few days, I've been set up at the Abbey Guest House, which is very nice. So I'm on campus. So it's been great to finally arrive. Forgive me though for the delay, I suppose, in putting this lecture out. I must confess, when I came up with my plan there as to what to do with Friday's lectures, I somewhat underestimated, I think, just how much the large journey from Ireland to Kansas in the space of a day would tire me out a little. So, on top of that, of course, upon arrival yesterday, I've had quite a few things to sort out, and just logistical and organisational things. Setting myself up now for the first time in Atchison, and also getting to see the campus and getting to know the town a little bit, because it's all new to me. So, I'm meeting a lot of new people as well. So, it's just been a busy time. So, thank you for kind of hanging in there, and I'm sorry I didn't put this lecture out yesterday as I had planned. It just wasn't really feasible in the end, but nevertheless, I hope better late than never. At least some of you might be able to catch some of this before we meet again tomorrow. Although I think with that in mind, what I plan to do for tomorrow's lecture, before I get stuck into that topic, which we'll cover tomorrow, I also probably will do a little bit of a recap of these two big topics in our first week in the survey course, Reconstruction and the birth of Jim Crow, because this is not an ideal way, I suppose, to teach or to come across me just talking into a screen, and so it'd be far better to kind of recap all these big things in person. So I might spend a little bit of tomorrow's lecture just doing that, just going over the ground, which we've barely covered really as of Wednesday and today. So, and a lot of things to cover as well. So basically what I wanted to talk to you about in today's kind of session is, in our first session, of course, we covered the first 12 years after the Civil War, the era commonly known as Reconstruction, from 1865 to 1877, or thereabouts. 1877 is commonly what's agreed on as kind of the end of the classic Reconstruction era. And today we're going to be covering the next dozen years after that again, so from 1877 to around 1890. And I suppose I'll explain the dates in a minute. Really, it was just 1877 marks the retreat of federal northern forces from the south, primarily the military, and all military protection, and a lot of kind of other organisations and institutions of northern help and aid to the newly freed African Americans. That occurred in 1877 as a consequence of the violent overthrow of the last southern state governments, which were still up until then black Republican, including Louisiana, Mississippi. Louisiana in 1874, really, Mississippi in 1875, for all practical purposes, and last but not least, South Carolina in October of 1876, which is when Wade Hampton became governor, off the back of a mass campaign of intimidation conducted by a group known as the Red Shirts. Nothing to do with the college Red Shirts, I should add, but nevertheless, that's what they wore and that's what they went by. Which successfully kind of intimidated the mass, and through violence and mass terror, the African American population of that state in that election cycle, as had been done in Mississippi in 1875 and Louisiana in 1874, by different groups of different names, but all essentially of the same agenda. In Mississippi, they were like the Knights of the White Camellia. In Louisiana in 1874, it was known as the White League. But essentially all the same purpose, even if different organisations and different people, which was to redeem the South, as they called it, from any kind of, not even black control, but any kind of African American influence in politics in the South. So that's why 1877 kind of marks the start of our lecture on the birth of Jim Crow, which was a very formalised legal system of official segregation between African Americans and white Americans, dating approximately from the late 19th century up until the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s. So it really got underway in this period just after Reconstruction, And so the period today is from 1877 to 1890. And 1890 is the reason I've chosen to bookend it for the birth of Jim Crow. 1890 also marked a special year because 1890 was the year when the last ever attempt by the federal government to intervene on behalf of African American protection was tried, known as the Lodge Force Bill of 1890, and we'll get on to that. 1890 was also the year in which a pioneering constitutional convention rewriting the Mississippi Constitution took place in the summer of 1890, which was really the first formal legal overthrow, de jure, not just de facto, of the radical Republican constitutional constitutions written up in the late 1860s, which at least in formal prose guaranteed the rights of the 13th, 14th and 15th Amendments, not only the end of slavery, but the equal rights that came with the 14th Amendment, and black male suffrage that came with the 15th Amendment. If we think back to Reconstruction in the late 1860s, Congress insisted, the radical Republicans in Congress insisted that in order for the former Confederate states to successfully re-enter the Union, they had to ratify the constitutional amendments passed by the federal Congress, the 13th, 14th and 15th, in order to be readmitted, which they all did by the year 1870, off the back of black male suffrage in the South being enacted in March and May of 1867. So they were able to elect much more radical constitutional conventions in 1868 through to 1870, which ratified these amendments and at least officially enshrined them into law. So the Constitutional Convention of Mississippi in 1890 marked the first overthrow, not just in practical terms that had occurred by 1877, but in formal legal terms. The Mississippi Constitution of 1890 rolled back all reference to the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, and through a poll tax, which was a way to try and navigate the admonitions of the federal constitution, effectively disenfranchised the vast bulk of the black population of Mississippi. The poll tax was a property tax. The Mississippi Constitution also instituted a literacy test. These were things which the Mississippi Convention introduced so that the federal government couldn't officially blame them for racial or racist legislation, even though the intent and the practical effect of such legislation was to discriminate overwhelmingly against African Americans, seen as they were generally the poorer members of the state, and the literacy rates were also less than whites in the state at the time. So that's kind of really, I guess, the formal system of Jim Crow, because the example set by the Mississippi Convention in 1890 rolled out across the rest of the southern states over the course of the decade up until the turn of the century. So, for instance, in Mississippi, you had, even long after the official democratic takeover in 1875, by 1890, at least formally, in certain parts of the state where there's overwhelming black majorities, population, you still had large numbers of black males officially on the voter registration books, tens of thousands. In the Mississippi's case, about 115,000. That was in 1890. By 1900 in Mississippi, you had that was reduced to about 1,000. So you can see over the course of that one decade, those black male Americans in Mississippi that hadn't been disenfranchised, by the end of that decade, nearly 100% of them were. And you see this process also then rolled out in other states who copy Mississippi's constitution, new state constitution. So Alabama is another good example. About 200,000 black male voters on the rolls in certain parts of the state in 1890, reduced to about 2,000 by the year 1900. Same story applies in Louisiana, another heavily black populated state, about 115,000 if memory serves me, in 1890, again reduced to less than 1,000 by 1900. So this process of black disenfranchisement and rolling back of Reconstruction and the radical Reconstruction of 1860s and 1870s, that process was really completed during the 1890s. And it also marked then the birth, during this decade when blacks were almost fully disenfranchised across the South. You also had the ruling out of Jim Crow segregation, and we'll get into the origins of segregation and why it was called after Jim Crow, because segregation also had a very long history going back to the nation's founding in the southern states, in the antebellum era as well as the postbellum era. So I want to kind of give the politics of the birth of Jim Crow from 1877 to 1890. I'm also going to give the ideological underpinnings of Jim Crow during the late 1870s and 1880s, what essentially new ideologies were forged to justify this mass discrimination across an entire region. I'm also going to give a little talk on the macroeconomics of the South at this time and what made it easier with Northern quiescence to introduce this Jim Crow segregation system. So I'm going to talk about how cotton remained so prevalent on the world markets, and the demand for cotton from the southern states that was so high in the antebellum era, that demand returns in the postbellum era. And so I'm going to talk a little bit to do with the effects of that. One of those was sharecropping, the other of which was something called convict leasing. In 1865, Frederick Douglass gave a famous speech in front of the American Anti-Slavery Society in Massachusetts. And he said, in which guise or in which skin will this old snake of racism rear its head once again? And so what he was referring to there was his conviction that in the South they would try to recreate their former slave society as closely as possible, and convict leasing was a key part of that. Because if you look closely at the wording of the 13th Amendment, it outlaws slavery in the United States, except in punishment of crime, and that becomes very key to the Southern attempt to essentially recreate the antebellum era by the 1880s and 1890s, and the reintroduction of Jim Crow. Because essentially now, all you had to do to effectively re-enslave some of the very same African Americans who had been enslaved was to claim or state that they had committed some sort of infraction of the law, that they were criminals. And once the African American in question had been criminalized, he could then be enslaved or made to work or labor for no money, effectively the same thing. And so convict leasing also begins to roll out across the 1880s. So we'll talk about that a little bit. So that's one final thing actually before I kind of roll up the introduction. I'm going to talk a little bit about the international context, which made it easier to justify the birth of Jim Crow segregation, which in its own way was a system just as racist as slavery had been. And in part this was due to the grand global international context. The late 19th century was the great era of empires, and none more so than the British Empire, which in conjunction with the French and the German and the Belgian and other European empires engaged in the 1880s and 1890s in something called the Scramble for Africa, in which more or less nearly all the African continent, except for what is present-day Ethiopia, was occupied by a variety of different European empires, mostly British. This is significant because in order to do this, the British themselves, which were once known as an abolitionist empire, because they had introduced the abolition of the slave trade and policed that abolition in the earlier 19th century, now had to instead roll back any egalitarian rhetoric in order to justify their invasion and occupation, and in fact often use much of the same rhetoric and same propaganda that Southerners used in justifying Jim Crow in the South. So you see there's an intimate connection there that feeds off each other. So the grand taking of the continent of Africa by different empires, especially the British, made it a lot easier for Southerners in the Jim Crow South to justify their own system, because they could effectively point to the global consensus now being that Africans or people from Africa were inferior. Whereas in the antebellum era, for example, you'll find that slaveholders in the South, one of their prime points of vulnerability and sensitivity was all the criticism they received in the then still very influential British press, which was read widely in America, which was often extremely critical of African American slavery in the South. Britain itself having established now a free trade, anti-slave empire, at least at that time, and which often stopped boats illegally reaching the South from the West African coast, which still occurred up until the mid-19th century. The British often took in a lot of African Americans who were due to be enslaved in the southern states, and so there was a lot of tension there, and there was a feeling of slaveholders in the South, that they were increasingly internationally isolated and under pressure. The opposite happens in this late part of the post-bellum era as we enter the late 19th century. So that's kind of the grand picture, as it were. So just to recap a little bit about, before we get into the introduction of Jim Crow segregation, we have to talk a little bit about the original revolution of integration that took place in the South immediately after the Civil War. So you'll find that with the introduction of radical Republican governments in 1867 across the South, at this time under military districts, under military commanders, you'll find that large areas, including in Louisiana and Texas, most of all under the command of General Phil Sheridan, who himself was also a radical Republican, forcibly introduced through the army into society integration for the first time, or for the first time certainly as long as the New Orleans had been under US rule since the early 19th century. And so you'll suddenly find that, remarkably, lots of Louisiana schools, transportation, streetcars most famously, we'll get onto that because that's the central point of contention that leads to Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. Streetcars, schools, public parks, public buildings, streets in the center of New Orleans, all of which were under army surveillance under Phil Sheridan, were forcibly integrated. And so this itself was a kind of a revolution in integration. All of a sudden, whites were forced to share the same facilities and the same space with many of their former slaves. The same process also carried out to some extent in Virginia and South Carolina. I guess the most famous examples of integration in the Reconstruction era is probably the Louisiana streetcars, which I've already referred to, in which, you know, in often very crowded streetcars, that you had always had an African American part, second class, and a white first class. Now that was all completely integrated, much to the protest of the local white population, and so that was a famous incident. The second famous one was probably the University of South Carolina, one of like the key institutions of the South, built by slaves, which had always been, you know, a bastion of Confederate ideology. That was also forcibly integrated under army control during Reconstruction. And so those are probably the two really famous instances of integration, which are also, not coincidentally, the first targets of segregation come 1877, come the end of major black influence, come the end of Reconstruction. You'll see in 1876, the University of South Carolina closes once the state is retaken by the former white Confederates and supremacists. It's then closed for 4 years. When it's opened in 1880, it's only white students allowed. And so that's the first major instance of a bastion of integration during Reconstruction being turned into segregation. Likewise, Louisiana streetcars, they are resegregated in the late 1870s. Although the laws aren't formally introduced until the 1880s, effectively they are. Eventually it's actually one particular black man who gets thrown off a streetcar in 1890s Louisiana, that his case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, which enshrines segregation as a national law that the South can implement, in the famous case of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, the famous case of justified of separate but equal. And that phrase, separate but equal, justifying segregation of the races, has a long history in the United States and in the antebellum era. And to give a bit of background as to why segregation itself was seen as so important to Southerners now that the slaves were emancipated, is because the Civil War had ended this very formal form of slavery, but it hadn't ended racial discrimination, and it hadn't convinced many, if any, Southerners of any significant change in views towards racial equality. There were a few instances, but not many. So, in other words, it was taken as granted that their whites would not live with African Americans because they were considered, due to the ideology that was brought in to justify slavery, African Americans were often considered in the South to be subhuman and therefore a danger to Southerners. The classic characterization of African Americans in the South by white slaveholders was that they were both childlike and dangerous or barbarous. So they're kind of both. They needed to be guided, but they also needed to be watched. So kind of that oxymoron was always at the center of the characterization of how African Americans were seen by the vast bulk of white Southerners and former white slaveholders. So The idea essentially that if emancipation were to take place, that the separation of races would then be necessary has long, deep roots going right back to the Revolutionary era. Indeed, during the era in the North in that time, in the late 18th century, was the time when New England, other parts of the North, New York City, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, a few other northern states were undergoing gradual emancipation, taking place over a couple of decades. But the question that the white U.S. citizens then asked themselves is what to do to themselves, what to do with emancipated slaves, because the conviction then was already that they couldn't successfully be integrated as equals into American society. This was a society, the U.S. society, as written in its Declaration of Independence and Constitution, that equality and the idea that every person had an equal chance or shot at life was so close to the philosophical heart of. So the idea that you would have a permanent caste, class, underclass across the nation, in this case African American, was something that really led to what was called the colonization movement in the antebellum era. And this was really the ideological history behind the segregation movement at the end of the 19th century. So the colonization movement basically was kind of a racist form of anti-slavery politics. It was against slavery as a means of business, as a means of economics, and even as a moral outrage, but insisted that African Americans were still not equal, partly due to race, that was the allegation, and also partly due to the idea that slavery itself and generations of slavery had left an indelible mark on those who had been enslaved, and that they would never be able to bridge the intellectual gap with white Americans. And so the idea put forward then was that, was really pushed by white establishment consensus from Jefferson's time onwards, was that free blacks, emancipated blacks, manumitted blacks, would be encouraged to leave the United States, either to return to Africa or to return to like an independent black republic in the Caribbean, like Haiti, for instance. But the idea being that they couldn't live alongside white Americans in the United States and therefore had to leave, therefore had to be separate. Part of the history of Jim Crow also, and the prevalence of this idea of segregation also dates back to the Indian removal movement of the early 19th century, in which nearly all tribes of Native Americans living east of the Mississippi, including many parts of the Deep South and other parts of the North, were forcibly relocated to west of the Mississippi, mostly Oklahoma, which was the territory designated for most of the reservations. Anyway, essentially the failure of the initial ambitions by the federal and state governments to civilize the Native Americans, and the fact that they couldn't control how white settlers often instigated wars at the border with Native Americans, meant that project broke down into almost constant warfare with Native Americans, and again led to the conclusion that Native Americans and white Americans could not share the North American continent and had to be physically separated or segregated. And again, it's around this time that ideas of manifest destiny begin to take seed and take fruit. The idea that the entire, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, should be a white man's republic. So anyway, that's kind of a lot of the antebellum history to the prevalence of this idea of segregation, which came so much to the fore almost immediately after the black Republican governments had been overthrown at the end of Reconstruction. That was why this idea was pushed so heavily so soon after Reconstruction, because that was the essential consensus opinion. So to give now kind of a little bit of the political journey from the end of Reconstruction to the birth of Jim Crow, we go back to the end of Reconstruction. So that is 1877, the Great Compromise over the contested election of 1877, which elected Rutherford B. Hayes, a Republican, but on the premise that in return he would demobilize and call back all Federal Army regiments that were still occupying parts of the South, primarily Louisiana and South Carolina. So you had a lot of regiments leave New Orleans and Charleston in this period, effectively then returning the South to self-rule, which became the central goal of the former Confederates after they lost the Civil War. So I've already talked a little bit about how one of their first acts in these states, black majority states, which were retaken at the end of Reconstruction, was in places like the Louisiana streetcars or the University of South Carolina. One of their first acts was to resegregate, and you'll see this kind of wave of resegregation rolled out across the South during the 1880s, although in quite a spotty format. Like, for instance, you had right until the end of the 1880s, you had some cities like Richmond and Virginia which were effectively quite heavily segregated, and then other parts of the state which weren't. And there wasn't a national or a wholesale regional regime of Jim Crow until after the turn of the 20th century. So you often still had quite a lot of parts of the South, parts of Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, which effectively had remained integrated until the turn of the century. But nevertheless, the process of resegregation started off the back of the efforts of Louisiana and South Carolina. Again, the other key date here, which I referred to earlier, was the Mississippi Convention, and the other half of that is the final attempt to, send federal forces back into the South in order to roll back a lot of the racist legislation being introduced. During Reconstruction, obviously there was often a lot of white terror, white vigilante violence, KKK most famously, all across the South. And in response to this, the radical Republicans in the federal Congress in DC introduced a number of what they called enforcement acts, so that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment could be enforced, not by state militias, but by the federal army. So the first and second and third enforcement acts were introduced in the years 1870 and 1871. The third being most famously called the KKK Act, which was by far the most radical and comprehensive, and effectively said that large parts of South Carolina and other states could, by the President of the United States, be declared under martial law. The writ of habeas corpus could be suspended, meaning that people could be arrested without evidence of crime, and held indefinitely until trial by the federal army, and that the sentencing was often ranged from 2 years in prison for a KKK member, or especially one who had committed the crime, all the way up to upwards of 10 to 15 years. And actually, although it was never carried out, the execution penalty was also part of the enforcement acts as well, and this was quite effective. So, in South Carolina, by 1871, large parts of the state which were finely balanced in terms of their demographics between white and black had descended into wholesale racial terror, where effectively the legalization of the murder of African Americans had commenced. And York County is a famous example of this, where nearly the entire male population of York County, South Carolina in 1871 were officially members of the Ku Klux Klan, including local politicians, policemen and judges. So this was an area which had kind of forgone moral legal codes and had descended into kind of a pure racialized violence, where local African Americans had no local resort to justice, and therefore the federal government intervened, suspended habeas corpus in York County and 9 other counties in October of 1871, and it was shown to be very effective. So once the professional federal army actually showed up in these counties in South Carolina, nearly all the Klan men ran for the hills, quite literally, into Appalachia, into different parts of the South. So really a lot of the leaders escaped, but a lot of the foot soldiers, hundreds and thousands of them, ultimately were at least tried, and at least hundreds then convicted and sent to jails across the North in 1871 to 1873. In other words, I say all this to show that the Force Acts, and when backed up by the Army of the North, could be quite effective in bashing the Klan and ensuring that the African Americans in the South had some protection, at least at some times. But critically, the KKK Act, which was already quite controversial because a lot of people in the North were disinclined to have such a powerful federal government. That was always, of course, the classic American worry, going back to the foundation of an overwhelming federal government power. It just about squeaked through both houses of Congress and was signed by U.S. Grant. That was the last Force Act. There was a second one that was meant to accompany the Civil Rights Act of 1875. Now, the Civil Rights Act would have introduced on a federal basis legal desegregation integration efforts across not only the South but the North, so that public utilities, public transportation, public areas, theatres, public accommodations, swimming pools, schools, etc., were all to be integrated under this law. And in order to carry out this law, it also the Civil Rights Act of 1875 had a supplementary force bill. But critically, I suppose the tide had turned decisively in the North from radical republicanism to moderate republicanism, and so the then Republican leaders, in order to appease the party base, passed the Civil Rights Act of 1875, but left it too long before Congress adjourned in order to pass the Force Act, which would effectively make the Civil Rights Act effective. So the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was almost completely toothless, had no federal enforcement provisions behind it, and was very little actually implemented across the South. In other words, in order for it was a very long process really, where the Force Act, with the Civil Rights Act of 1875, was on the books. So what that would mean is that if a African American in the South entered a streetcar and was told to go to the back to the African American section, which was often second class, he could then, off the back of the Civil Rights Act, take a case to court, first in local areas, but then ultimately to the Supreme Court. But such a process, of course, took years, and even if, in the case of victory, and there wasn't because it was quite a conservative Supreme Court, it was really a very ineffective way for African Americans to defend their social rights in the South. So almost completely ineffective, again, without the Federal Army. The Federal Army of the North is what, and its place in the South is what effectively determined the contours of Reconstruction. With an army, Reconstruction and African American rights were secured. Without an army, often local African Americans were overwhelmed by white racist resistance. And obviously the great period of lynching begins during Reconstruction and continues through the Jim Crow segregation era. So you see now that's the kind of the background, as it were, to the end of Reconstruction. So Rutherford B. Hayes becomes president in 1877 off the back of retreating from the South, a decision he comes to very much regret. If you look at his presidential message of 1878, in which he says that the South is now almost all white Democrat and it was a mistake to take the compromise. And nevertheless, I mean, Hayes does little with the South with his administration. He's followed by James Garfield as the next president. Now, in the short time he was alive, of course, he was assassinated by a job seeker quite shortly after he became president in 1881. It appeared that, again, he took quite a laissez-faire approach to any kind of effective intervention in Southern affairs that would have been costly and that would have required the army. In fact, quite noticeably, James Garfield was actually one of those who deliberately, in 1875, passed the Civil Rights Act without the supplementary force bill. So he was one of those Republicans who were more moderate than radical. Again, Garfield's ideas essentially were centered around sending more northern philanthropic institutions into the South in order to educate African Americans. But he died very shortly after entering office. Chester A. Arthur had a little more engagement, who was the succeeding president, a little more engagement with Southern affairs. For instance, for a time, he had an alliance with something called the filibuster movement in Virginia, which was a class movement, actually, which, at least to a certain extent, bridged the racial divide. Can't get too much into that, but effectively to say that Chester A. Arthur introduced no more legislation to intervene in the South himself either. Partly because he was a lame duck president after the assassination of Garfield. Then in 1884 we have the election of Grover Cleveland, the first Democrat president since the Civil War, since before the Civil War, since James Buchanan of the late 1850s. He, of course, considering a significant amount of his voter base and support base was in the South, naturally was disinclined to do anything to interrupt what southern state legislatures were doing to introduce segregation. However, of course, the next Republican administration was that of Benjamin Harrison in 1888 to 1892, and it was in his administration where the last efforts to introduce some kind of force bill so that the federal army could intervene on some basis in the South was introduced by a Massachusetts senator called Henry Cabot Lodge in 1890. This bill failed by just a few votes, actually almost on the same day that that famous Mississippi Convention met to write a new state constitution. So you can see that 1890, in the summer of 1890, is a critical turning point where what had been taking place after Reconstruction in the South is now cemented into place and then enrolled more fully across the entire region through the 1890s, as I described at the start of the lecture, in terms of the mass and almost complete disenfranchisement of African American males, what there remained thereof, by the year 1900. So, I want to talk a little bit as well about the ideological underpinnings of what Southerners, former slaveholders did in the South, former Confederates did in the South in the 1870s and 1880s to resegregate. One I've already mentioned, in that in order to justify slavery for centuries, it was very inbuilt in Southern society that African Americans were inferior. That justified their enslavement, that they were intellectually childlike, but that they needed to be, guided through life from cradle to grave. But that they were also, fundamentally dangerous and less able to control themselves and exert power over themselves. I mean, due to the kind of the racial line in the South, primarily through the 18th, 19th centuries, the primary fear alongside slavery had always been what in 1864 was eventually called miscegenation, racial intermixing, because such importance was placed on the difference of race. Hence, this was the primary fear. I mean, the irony, of course, of all this is that African American women who were enslaved in the South from the 1600s onwards were almost always subjected by their white overlords to sexual assault and rape, and so much so that there was actually a sizable mixed white-black population in the South, simply due to the fact that African American slave women were so often taken advantage of by their white slave masters, and they were punished if they didn't go along. And so the irony of this, of course, is that white male lust in the antebellum South was not critiqued at all, but what was feared by those who led Southern society was the mixing of white women and black men, and this was and the idea that black men pose some kind of unique sexual threat. The irony, I know, given that the very real sexual threat to black women posed by white men in the South, especially white slaveholders, but they basically inverted this and accused their opposite of what they themselves were guilty of. And so the myth of this kind of virulent, virile, uncontrolled black male who was more prone to sexual violence, that became prevalent during the antebellum era and was carried on through in books, in visual aids, in visual propaganda, in state law, right through once again after the end of Reconstruction. So all those fears of miscegenation from the antebellum era were resurrected once the whites had reclaimed control of Southern state governments in 1877. And so, I mean, I won't kind of, unfortunately I don't have a PowerPoint or anything with me now, but it's worth, in a book like Stony the Road, which is a great book talking about Reconstruction, white supremacy, and the rise of Jim Crow, which I'd recommend. In fact, actually, I might just have a copy of it here. Yes, this book, which I think I'll try and request the college library have a copy of, if they don't already. Yes, by Henry Louis Gates Jr. It's a fantastic book, with not only detailing the kind of the process of how Jim Crow came to be in detail, but also giving a wealth of visual aids to justify this process, and how essentially African Americans were depicted in public media. Popular public culture at the time went a long way to justifying Jim Crow segregation. I mean, some of these visual aids are so offensive that I probably won't show them to you now, but they are contained within this book for you to look at yourselves, once hopefully a copy of it can be obtained. But nevertheless, this book gives a really good sense of how Jim Crow was rolled out across the South with the help of a lot of popular public culture and a changed depiction of African Americans. That's also as testament to this overwhelming priority given to miscegenation and the introduction of Jim Crow. A way to prop up this myth of the black male as inherently dangerous was lynching itself as a campaign. Um, the lynching that took place in Atchison, Kansas, in January of 1870, was actually over an accident that took place which injured a white man. But the vast majority of lynchings, especially in the South, came after accusations of sexual intercourse between white women and black men, either consensual or otherwise. Now, I mean, the evidence base for such was limited. Often, a local black leader would be targeted for accusation, and then popular fury would do the rest in terms of the lynching process would then begin. So, thousands of, well, at least hundreds per year in most states across the South, overwhelmingly black men, 95% or thereabouts, some black women, but nearly all black men, were lynched, often violently, and without any due process of law, as happened to George Johnson here in Atchison in 1870. In fact, actually, what happened to George Atchison was a kind of an archetypal example of exactly how lynchings went down across the South, as Jim Crow was rolled out in the last couple of decades of the 19th century. So George Johnson was found somewhere in the centre of Atchison, taken to where Commercial meets 4th Street, where, I mean, he was found in a house, shot 3 times, taken to where Commercial meets 4th Street, hung there, also continued to be shot and beaten and whipped. Remarkably, somehow was still alive, incredibly, and somewhat gruesomely, and then was taken to 5th Street Viaduct, where eventually he was hung for good, whilst his body was also mutilated. So an extreme amount of violence went into this process of Jim Crow. I don't give that detail gratuitously, but to say that in order to enact this system across the South, often an extreme amount of highly terrorised racial violence was needed, and the lynching of George Johnson in Atchison was a good example of that. An example, of course, as well, considering that Atchison was a free state and a northern state, of just how widespread racist opinion was at this time. So yes, I've talked then about most of the other other aspects of ideology I wanted to get onto. Yeah, so part of the reintroduction of Jim Crow segregation was justified with something called an ideology known as the Lost Cause, now which kind of redid was from a Southerner's biased perspective as to what the Civil War was all about. But critically, an aspect of the Lost Cause was also called the Resurrection of the Old South, and basically a lot of what was called plantation literature spread throughout the 1870s and 1880s in the South that put forward the idea that really slavery wasn't so bad for African Americans, and in fact it was the system best fitted for them and for their natures. And in fact slavery was, and the relationship between slave and slave master was as benevolent as could be between the two races, and that essentially it effectively, without being able to formally legally do so, these pamphlets put forward the idea that a slave system or society in the South needed to be recreated in practice, if not in theory. Again, actually the book I refer to here kind of covers that in good detail, with a lot of visual aids as to how this propaganda was ruled out. I'll see if I can find, actually, now that I'm here, a good example of what was known as plantation literature. Yes, so obviously there are fears stemming from, there's some good aspects. There's the original pamphlet produced on miscegenation in 1864, just as the Civil War was coming to an end. That's when the term miscegenation was coined, and that's when concerns about racial intermixing significantly resurfaced, when it appeared that the Union was going to win the Civil War and the South was going to be reconstructed. So I'll see if I can find some examples of what was called plantation literature. If not, I might try and bring this book with me to the lecture perhaps and show you some. So the resurrection of the Old South, it was called, which was part of the ideology of the Lost Cause. And then finally, I suppose I want to kind of move on to also part of the ideological underpinning, I should say, was the cementing in public respect of hardened ideas of race science, social Darwinism, racial difference, as seen in the sciences practiced by the top universities in the country at the time in phrenology, eugenics, social Darwinism, all of which effectively put forward the idea, as opposed to Genesis in the Bible, that there had been separate origins, special origins for separate races, and that they were fundamentally different. Because the Christian interpretation through Genesis was that one man was made of one blood the world over, and of course, with the rise of secular hard scientific reasoning, this came under significant assault in the postbellum era, and this is also part of the secularization of American society that came in the late 19th century. One final thing to get onto, as to the kind of the context which helped the rollout of Jim Crow, was the macroeconomics of cotton. So, cotton, of course, was always the South's staple crop throughout the 19th century. It came to an end more or less during the Civil War years, but the demand for cotton, once the Civil War was over, quickly returned, but now from all over the world. And so twice as much cotton was sold in 1890 than in 1860, twice as much again in 1920 than in 1890. So the business of cotton continued to expand, and it was still very profitable to be a large-scale southern cotton landowner. But now, of course, African Americans instead took part in this economy as sharecroppers, which, as I referred to in my Reconstruction lecture, due to the failure for there to be any land ownership revolution for African Americans in the late 1860s, it meant that they were still fundamentally dependent upon their old slave masters for economic sustenance. And so they would rent land from their old slave masters who still owned the land, and in return for being able to produce their own crop, they would share crop. They would produce some of the cotton for the landowner. But now, of course, the world was also subjected to a glut of cotton. As a consequence of the Civil War and the South being out of the cotton system, new areas were introduced to cotton: Egypt, India, different parts of the Middle East. And so now there was a world glut of cotton, which, whereas cotton prices were exponentially rising before the war, they were exponentially decreasing after the war. So it was still profitable to be a large-scale cotton landowner, but now to be an independent cotton producer meant that almost certainly you were in some form of debt peonage to your former slave master. So that helped embed the Jim Crow system. And of course, convict lease, which was a system really pioneered in Georgia in the early 1880s, whereby vagrancy laws were introduced, which is something that they tried to do in 1865, 1866 with the Black Codes, which effectively criminalized black unemployment. So any black that was even partially unemployed, and these vagrancy laws would be such that if, say, African American male was found walking down the street not gainfully employed, he was therefore deemed to be a tramp or a vagrant, was then arrested and sentenced often to 5-10 years of hard labour. So many of the trains at this time, the train system of the South, which is how the old South became the new South with a newly industrialised economy in certain parts, and connections between urban areas. Most of these trains, some of which you may still ride on today, were actually built effectively with what still remained of African American slave labour, in practice, not in theory. So, and in fact, the flip side of this is that when African Americans were property before the war, there was at least some twisted incentive for their owners to take care of them, whereas now that African Americans were no longer property, and instead were subject to just the rigors of the free market economy, it meant that their employers, who didn't pay them, also felt no sense of even noblesse oblige or propriety over their welfare. So you often find these convict lease camps in the South had horrific death rates, upwards of 30-40% a year. So in other words, the chances were for any given African American who was sentenced to work in a hard labour camp somewhere in the South in the 1880s, the chances were that was a death sentence, mostly due to overwork, brutal treatment, whipping, often by men who used to be overseers on plantations, and also just malnourishment. This is a grim picture, I'm aware, but it's necessary to know so it can be explained how it was that across the entirety of the South, this Jim Crow segregation system came to be embedded successfully, and then remained that way for the 20th century up until the 1960s. Okay, so I think I've covered all the major points I wanted to cover today. I know I covered, again, quite a lot of ground, quite a lot of detail. So what I might do tomorrow, even though I guess we're starting on to a slightly new topic or for the lecture, I might start just by going over some of this Reconstruction and rise of Jim Crow stuff again, because it's quite detailed. A lot happens in the 1860s, 1870s. There's a lot to study. A lot also happens in the 1880s and 1890s in the birth of this new system. So there's revolution, there's counter-revolution, there's a lot going on. So I guess in my lecture, when we meet again tomorrow, I might do a recap of these first two lectures before I get stuck into the third, if that's okay. Okay, so I suppose that's us for today. I look forward to actually meeting you all finally in person tomorrow. It'll be great. And I want to thank you, those of whom I've met, students and staff that I've met so far upon arrival, for your very friendly welcome and introduction to college life, which has been fantastic. Okay, so see you all tomorrow.